I felt the fluorescent lights pressing down on me the way memories sometimes do, heavy and close, as I walked into that cafeteria again. The same place where everything had started to tilt without warning, and I could still feel the echo of that moment when instinct rose inside me like a quiet alarm. Even before my mind understood anything at all, I had stepped away from the table to take the call from the financial advisor, the one confirming that the last portion of the lottery payout had landed in my account, and hearing that number again made my breath hitch, not because I was greedy, but because after a lifetime of scraping and patching and hoping, it felt unreal to have something that large with my name on it. And while I was still trying to settle the shock, I walked back toward the table where the son and his partner sat, smiling like everything was normal, and I bumped his arm by accident, just the slightest brush of movement. But something changed in the air, something flickered in the way he pulled back from me, the way he tried to cover whatever he had been reaching for. And as the coffee cups slid across the table in that tiny shuffle, I saw the chipped rim on one of them, and without thinking at all, my hand moved, and I switched the cups, and I have no idea what pushed me to do it, but it felt like a tug from somewhere older than fear, older than logic, the kind of instinct a man earns from watching too many things go wrong in slow motion. And for a strange moment my pulse thudded against my ribs, as if warning me, you know this feeling, you know danger, even when it hides behind a smile. But I said nothing because I was trying to believe in family, trying to believe that love and blood meant something more than money, trying to believe the son sitting across from me was still the child I had once lifted onto my shoulders to watch fireworks over the river. I sat down again, pretending everything was fine, while inside me something old and wounded stirred, and for a moment I wondered if Margaret had been right all along, the warnings she whispered in the dim light long before she left this world, the things she saw in that woman, and the ways she feared they would twist him into a shape she would not recognize. And as we sat there, the chipped mug now resting on the far side of the table in front of him, I tried to ignore the tug inside me and watched him leaning forward with that forced brightness in his voice, telling me about an investment opportunity, a real chance, Dad, something big. And the woman beside him nodded with that polished calmness she always wore, like expensive clothing, her hand resting on his arm as if to remind him what to say next. And everything in me tightened as I listened, because I had heard this tone before, the one where he pretended this was about helping me when the truth was sitting naked between every word. And I told him no, and the temperature dropped like someone had opened a freezer door. And then she slipped away to the restroom, or at least that was her excuse, and the silence she left behind felt brittle like the surface of thin ice, and he stared at me with eyes that once sparkled with childhood curiosity, but now carried something darker, something that had learned how to see me not as a father, but as an obstacle. And then she came back and placed 2 coffees down between us, one for him and one for me. Her smile stretched thin and practiced, and I reached for the chipped one because something inside me told me to take it the way a voice might tell you not to step into the street when a car is coming, even if you do not hear the engine yet. And then my phone buzzed, and I rose and walked away to answer, and the entire time I kept glancing back at the table, watching the two of them, watching the way they leaned toward each other, and the way his hand moved near both cups when he thought I was not looking. And when I returned and bumped his arm again, the liquid sloshed, and the cups shifted, and the chipped one was now sitting in front of him, and I did nothing to fix it, because that instinct inside me was no longer a whisper but a steady throb of warning. And I sat down again, my palms sweating just a little, though I tried not to show it, and we talked for a few minutes about nothing and everything. But his voice kept drifting back to that same desperation, the one he hid behind jokes and half smiles. And I felt the weight of something coming, like watching storm clouds roll slowly toward you across open fields. And then he lifted the chipped mug and took a drink, and the entire room felt like it went silent, as if holding its breath. And I watched not the cup but his face, the way his expression shifted, the way confusion crept into his eyes like a shadow slipping across a wall. And 5 minutes later, he whispered that he did not feel well, and sweat started to bead along his forehead, and his hands began trembling, and the woman beside him leaned in with panic that looked too rehearsed to be real, and everything inside me turned to ice, because the truth was standing right there in plain sight, and it hurt in a way I had no words for the kind of hurt that comes when someone you love chooses greed over blood and then over breath. And when he started to seize and the medical staff rushed in and the woman kept whispering empty reassurances while her eyes darted toward my untouched coffee, I felt something inside me split open like a fault line, and the truth poured through. And as they wheeled him away, and the doctor demanded the cups for testing, and the guard later pulled me aside with that video showing everything, the shaking hands, the little plastic bag, the powder falling into the chipped mug, I felt the world tilt in a slow, painful rotation, and all I could hear was Margaret whispering again, "Watch that woman around him." And I felt the sting of knowing she had been right, and I had been blind, and that is where everything began, not with the poison, not with the plan, but with that single moment at a cafeteria table where instinct reached for my hand and saved my life before my heart could understand what my blood already knew. The hallway outside the ER felt too bright, too clean, too full of voices that did not touch the heaviness, pressing against my ribs as I stood there watching nurses rush past, carrying charts and supplies, while every few seconds my eyes drifted to the closed doors where they were trying to stabilize the son who had tried to poison me, and I could not understand how the world could keep moving around me so calmly when something so fundamental inside me had cracked, and I sat in one of those hard plastic chairs with my hands clasped together like they were holding the last pieces of something fragile, and I kept replaying the moment when the chipped mug passed to his side, the way he lifted it, the way he drank without hesitation, and I wondered if he had felt any guilt at all, or if the promise of my lottery winnings had burned everything human out of him long before today. And when the guard approached me, the one whose name I had said 100 times in passing, without ever giving it a second, thought the man who walked the halls with quiet steadiness and eyes that missed nothing, he stood there in the corridor, shifting his weight, like someone carrying news. He wished he did not have to deliver, and he asked to speak privately, his voice low, not out of secrecy but because he understood. Something terrible had already settled between us, and as he lifted his phone and showed me the video of the cafeteria, I felt something slow and cold spread through me like winter water, because seeing it with my own eyes was different from suspecting it, and the image of my son leaning forward and pouring something from the small plastic bag into what he thought was my cup hit me harder than any punch I had ever taken in my life, and I did not look away because I needed to know. I needed the truth, even if it carved straight into me. And when the woman glanced around nervously, then nodded at him and whispered something I could not hear, it felt like watching the last thread between us snap clean. And the guard said he had hesitated earlier because the spill had confused things and he was not sure what he had seen. But once the seizure started, he had known this was no accident, and he had done what good men do. He acted and called the right people, and while he spoke, something inside me steadied, because in that instant, when everything familiar turned rotten, this stranger had stepped in, as if the universe refused to let me face the darkness alone. And when the police were called and the doctor was given the footage, I walked back to the waiting room and saw that the woman had vanished, leaving nothing but the echo of her perfume, and I followed my instinct again, stepping outside just in time to catch her pushing through the glass doors, her hands shaking, her lipstick smudged, her eyes wild in the way that had nothing to do with grief. And I asked her where she was going, and she said she could not do this. She could not watch him suffer, and I wanted to believe her for half a heartbeat, wanted to believe she cared about something other than money, but her voice cracked, and then the truth spilled out of her, like a confession she never meant to give. She said it was supposed to be me, not him. The pills were supposed to make me confused enough to sign the papers, the forged documents, the false declaration that I needed help managing the winnings. And hearing her speak those words, hearing her say, I was old alone, that I did not need the money, that what they planned was mercy of a twisted kind, made the entire hallway tilt, because she had not only tried to take my life, she had stripped it of value and purpose with her words, as if I were a burden they were entitled to relieve themselves of. And when the officers walked through the pot entrance, and she saw them, and tried to run, the fear on her face was not the fear of someone who regretted a mistake, but someone terrified of losing access to the money she thought she deserved. And after they took her aside and questioned her, and the hours unfolded in waves of police reports and examination results, and the doctor explaining that if I had drunk That coffee, it could have killed me. The stillness inside me grew heavy, the kind that comes when betrayal wounds deeper than any physical blow, and I sat alone for a moment in that hospital corner, while the truth settled inside me like dust, and I realized something that hurt even more than the attempt on my life. The son had not been manipulated into this. He had chosen it, and that choice had eaten away at something sacred, something I had believed would never break, not between father and child. And as they cuffed him later, after he recovered and looked at me with eyes that barely held recognition, I felt no anger, just a hollow ache, because the worst part of being betrayed by someone. Love is not the act itself, but the moment you understand they would do it again if the reward were large enough. And that is when I understood something. Margaret had tried to tell me, not with anger but with sorrow, that some people do not break all at once. They break over years in small, quiet ways until the pieces of who they once were no longer resemble anything you recognize. And standing in that hallway, I felt the weight of that knowledge settling inside me, and I knew that whatever came next, the truth of what had happened could never be undone. The courtroom felt smaller than I expected, as if the walls had quietly drawn closer over the months between the arrest and the trial, and every time I walked in and saw him sitting at the defense table wearing that plain jumpsuit, his wrists resting on the metal cuffs, I felt something twist inside me. Not anger, not pity, something harsher, something shaped by grief and disbelief, mixed together until the edges blurred. And while the prosecutor laid out the case, the footage from the cafeteria, the pharmacy records showing the prescription she had filled, the forged documents and the journal they found in their home, where she detailed every step of the plan, with his handwriting scattered through the margins, I kept waiting for him to look at me, not with rage, not with fear, but with recognition, as if somewhere beneath the ruin a part of him remembered who I was to him, but his gaze stayed fixed on the table like he was afraid of what he'd see if he looked up, and I listened to his lawyer argue that he was manipulated, that the woman had coerced him, that he was weak and desperate but not malicious. And every time they said he didn't know what he was doing, I thought of that video, the way he looked around the cafeteria before pouring the powder into the chipped mug, and the way his hand didn't shake, not one bit. And I knew he had made the choice all on his own, no matter how much he wanted someone to blame alongside himself. And when the verdict finally came back 3 hours later, guilty on all counts, he turned his head just enough for our eyes to meet. And in that split second, I did not see anger or denial or even fear. I saw shame, raw and unfiltered, and it struck me harder than the betrayal itself, because it meant he understood what he had done, and the weight of it had finally settled onto his shoulders instead of mine. Afterward, when people walked out of the courtroom, whispering words I didn't listen to, my daughter stood beside me, her hand gripping my arm tighter than she realized, and the guard from the hospital waited outside, as if he knew I needed a familiar face in the sea of cold ones, and he told me again that he had just been doing his job. But I looked at him and knew that was not true, that what he had done was what good men do when nobody is watching. He paid attention and he acted, and that was more than most people ever manage in moments where it counts. And I asked him quietly how much he made in a year, and the number was so low it felt insulting, considering he had saved my life without hesitation. So I told him about the fund I planned to set up for his daughter's education, the investment into the business he dreamed of starting, and he tried to refuse at first, his voice tight with pride. But I told him this wasn't charity, it was gratitude, and sometimes a man needs to learn the difference between being handed something and being honored for what he has done. And he understood, then, his eyes shining but steady, and he shook my hand like the gesture meant something deeply personal. And afterward I went home, to an emptier house than before, even though nothing inside it had changed. The same worn chair, the same old photos, the same faded smell of Margaret's roses in the hallway. But something in the air had shifted, something heavy, something final. And over the next year, while he served his sentence, I stayed away. Not because I wanted to punish him, but because I needed the distance to understand what forgiveness meant when the wound came from your own blood. And my daughter visited him, sometimes telling me he had changed, that he was reading, taking classes, working in the library, talking less, but listening more. And every time she told me these things, I felt something quiet move inside me. Not Trust, not yet, but maybe the beginning of something that could grow if I let it. And in the second year, when I finally walked into that visiting room, with its low ceiling and sour smell, he looked older, thinner, the spark he had once carried dulled by time and consequence, and he apologized not to save himself, not to earn anything, but because he had finally seen his reflection clearly enough to hate what he had become, and all I wanted was to understand why. But the truth was simpler and crueler than I expected. He said he was drowning, and he forgot that I was a person before I was a pocket of money could reach for, and hearing that hurt in a way I cannot explain, because he was admitting he had stopped seeing me as his father long before the poisoning, and I told him then about what his mother used to say, the warnings, she whispered, the worry she carried inside her for years, and remorse folded over him like a shadow, and the months that followed were slow and clumsy, but real. He rebuilt piece by piece the parts of himself he had let rot, and when he was finally released after 3 years and 2 months, he didn't ask for help or money or forgiveness. He only asked if I'd talk to him once a week, and I said yes because something in me needed that too, even if I didn't know what future those conversations would lead to. And in the quiet of those days, I learned that rebuilding trust doesn't happen in grand gestures, but in the small, steady proof that someone is trying to be better than they were the day before. When he finally stood outside the halfway house, months after his release, shifting his weight like a man, afraid to hope for too much, I understood something I hadn't been ready to face. Before that healing doesn't arrive in a single moment, it creeps in quietly the same way damage does, slow, steady, almost invisible, until one day you notice the weight you've been carrying doesn't pull quite as hard. And the afternoon I invited him to lunch, the place Margaret used to love, with the red vinyl booths and the smell of frying onions, drifting through the air like memory itself. I watched him walk in looking smaller than I remembered, shoulders drawn in like he wasn't sure if he belonged in the same world as the people around him, and I kept my hands around the warm mug in front of me, waiting for him to sit, and he did, slowly, as if afraid the chair might reject him, and when the server poured us both coffee, I noticed the way he hesitated before touching the cup, and that tiny pause hit me harder than anything he'd said in prison, because it meant he remembered what he had tried to do, who he had tried to become, and shame had etched itself so deep into him. It changed the way he reached for something as simple as a drink, and before the food arrived, I told him plainly, firmly, that I'm going to give him money. I wasn't going to bail him out, buy him a house, or invest in any dream he couldn't stand on with his own legs, and he nodded with that quiet acceptance of a man who had learned the hard way that shortcuts only lead to you into deeper holes, and I watched him swallow that truth, without flinching, as if he had already decided he would rather climb honestly than fall again through the same trapdoor. And after a long moment, I slid the envelope across the table, the letter of recommendation inside it, the one I had spent days writing carefully, rewriting, searching for words that weren't soaked in pity but in possibility. And when he opened it and read the name of the construction company run by an old friend of mine, the way his hands trembled told me more than any apology ever had, and he whispered, "Thank you," like the words were almost too heavy to lift. And that was when I told him he'd be answering to Harold, not me. And for a moment a strange light flickered across his face, something close to the boy he used to be before greed and pressure, and the wrong woman twisted everything crooked, and for a second I could almost see the child who used to chase the dog across the yard, shrieking with laughter, while Margaret stood by the kitchen window pretending to be annoyed, but smiling anyway. And maybe that was why I said what I said next, that this wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't forgetting. It was a chance, and chances don't come wrapped in guarantees. They come with work, sweat, and the kind of honesty that feels like standing in cold water and letting it sting until you stop flinching. And he nodded again, the kind of nod that comes from humility, and I watched something settle into him. Something I had wished for without daring to ask for a long time, some tiny seed of wanting to be a good man. For real. Not for appearances, not for approval, and as we ate I found myself talking about Margaret, the lottery, the years that had passed, and he listened without interrupting, without drifting, without selling anything, and that simple act, listening, truly listening, felt like a step, a quiet, fragile step toward something neither of us could name yet. And it struck me that maybe this was how rebuilding happened, not through grand gestures or emotional reckonings, but but through sitting across from each other in an old diner drinking coffee from mugs that didn't carry chipped rims, and choosing again and again not to run from the truth. And when the meal ended and we walked outside, he looked at me with a careful steadiness and said he'd work hard, that he'd earn whatever future he tried to build. And I believed him not, because trust had returned fully, but because for the first time in years, he wasn't searching my face for what he could take. He was searching for who he could become, and that was enough to let the door stay open, even if only a crack. When the job finally came through a month later, and he called me from the sidewalk outside the construction yard, his voice carried a tremor I hadn't heard since he was a teenager, calling home after his first real failure, and I could picture him standing there in a borrowed pair of work boots, holding the paper packet with his schedule and safety rules, trying to decide whether this was the start of something or just another place life might spit him out. And that night I sat in my quiet kitchen, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, and thinking about how strange it is that a man can live nearly 70 years and still feel unprepared for the way a single phone call can twist something tight inside him, because I wanted him to succeed, but I also needed him to understand that success meant nothing if it came without integrity. And in the weeks that followed, he called every Sunday, just like he'd promised, short calls, awkward at first, filled with long pauses and the kind of halting small talk people use when trying to stitch something back together with threads too thin to trust. But slowly the pauses grew comfortable, and his updates shifted from careful news of keeping his head down to stories about the work itself, the weight of lumber on his shoulder, the rough banter with the crew the first time. Foreman nodded at him with something like respect, and I could feel something solid forming under his words, something he was building inside himself, plank by plank. And during that time I let the days pass, quietly fixing the house Margaret and I had bought 40 years earlier, replacing the roof she used to complain about, repairing the sagging fence, painting the trim she'd wanted, white but never got around to finishing. And in the garden I planted roses in the pattern she had drawn years ago, the one she kept taped to the inside of a cookbook she never used, and when they bloomed it felt like she was still somewhere in the yard, watching me with that soft, stubborn smile she'd carry when she knew I was finally doing something she'd asked me to do back when she was alive. And one afternoon, while I was pruning the roses, a letter arrived from Sarah with photos of the kids playing soccer in the rain and a note telling me she was proud of how I'd handled everything, proud of the way I'd shown Marcus both the truth and a path. And reading her words, I felt something warm settle in my chest, something that told me not everything I had done as a father had gone wrong, not every seed I planted had withered, and the years moved like water, slow but steady, shaping the edges of everything they touched. And James's construction company, the one I'd helped him start, grew faster than either of us expected. Hired 3 more veterans in the first year, then 5, then more after that. And every time he called to update me, his voice carried the kind of pride that didn't need to be dressed up. It was just there, honest and earned. And I realized that maybe the lottery had brought out greed and desperation in one corner of my family, but it had also revealed generosity and loyalty in another. And one Saturday, 7 years after the ticket that changed everything, I stood inside the 7-Eleven, picking up my usual scratch-off, not because I needed to win, but because ritual matters, because hope matters, because Margaret would have laughed if I'd ever stopped, and a young woman in front of me dropped her wallet, and when I handed it back she looked closely and asked if I was the man who won the lottery, the one whose son tried to poison him. And I smiled and said, I used to be, now I'm just Victor. And she told me she wasn't speaking to her father over money. And she laughed and said, always money, right? And something in her eyes reminded me of Marcus years ago, lost and angry and trying to pretend he wasn't. And I told her that not everything breaks because of money. Sometimes it breaks because people forget who they are when money touches them. Sometimes it breaks because trust is fragile and careless. Hands can crush it. And when she walked out, thoughtful, quiet, maybe considering a phone call she'd been too proud to make, I walked to my car, coffee in hand, and breathed in the warm air of an ordinary day. And somewhere across town, Marcus was working at the hardware store, lifting boxes, helping customers, learning patience and humility by the pound. And it wasn't the ending I imagined when the lottery check arrived, but it felt honest, it felt earned. And as I drove home past the roses blooming soft and stubborn the way Margaret liked them, I realized that maybe redemption doesn't come wrapped in apologies. Maybe it arrives in repetition, in steady work, in quiet mornings, in choosing, again and again, to be better than who you were yesterday. And for the first time since that awful day in the cafeteria, I let myself believe that Marcus was choosing that too. I kept thinking the ending would feel like a door slamming shut, but instead it felt more like a slow settling, the way dust drifts after a long silence, and you watch it in a shaft of afternoon light, realizing the world is still here, still, turning even when everything inside you has been cracked open and rearranged, and year 7 slipped quietly into year 8, with mornings that no longer carried the echo of hospital machines or courtroom whispers. And sometimes I would sit on the back porch with my coffee, letting the steam rise into the cool air, and I would think about how close I came to disappearing into a grave dug by the hands I once taught to hold a hammer steady and trust their strength. Then the phone would buzz, and it would be Marcus, reminding me it was Sunday and that he was walking to the bus stop because the halfway house rules still lingered in his routine, even though he no longer lived there, and each call felt like a test he was taking, not for me but for himself. And I could hear the effort in his voice, the way he tried not to rush past the hard parts, the way he let guilt breathe without letting it swallow him. He told me small things, a customer who thanked him for kindness, a coworker who invited him for coffee, the smell of sawdust that clung to his clothes at the end of every shift, like proof he had built something that day. And sometimes he apologized again, quietly, simply, but the apologies no longer tried to rewrite the past. And I stopped needing to brace myself when I heard them, because they came from someone who understood that remorse was not a sentence, it was a choice renewed every day. And once he asked me if I thought forgiveness was supposed to hurt, and I told him yes, real forgiveness always hurts, because it means you loved someone enough for their betrayal to matter, and you still choose to look them in the eye anyway. And he cried, then not in loud choking bursts, but in a low trembling way that reminded me of when he was a boy and scraped his knee trying to leap between two rocks because he believed he could fly if he just wanted it enough. And I realized that somewhere along the line he had lost the part of himself that believed he could rise without stepping on others, and now he was trying to grow that part back, piece by piece, and I told him he was doing enough, more than enough. And the line went silent, with the kind of silence people make when they are learning how to forgive themselves. And Sarah visited, often bringing the kids who ran through my yard, chasing each other between the roses Margaret planted with her tiny, neat handwriting marking where each color would bloom, and the kids would ask about the lottery as if it was some myth, like finding treasure under the floorboards, and I would laugh and tell them the truth that the real treasure was learning, which people hold steady when everything shifts and which ones break or break you. And sometimes I caught Sarah looking at Marcus during family dinners, a softness in her eyes that told me she saw the work he was doing, the way he flinched at old memories, but pushed forward anyway, and the two of them began stitching something delicate and newly born, not the old sibling bond, but something quieter, patient, built with careful hands, the kind you use when piecing together a fragile vase shattered long ago. And one morning as I fixed the squeaky hinge on the back gate, I realized I was no longer waiting for the other shoe to drop. The fear that had lived beneath my ribs, the fear that my own blood might betray me again, had loosened its grip, and what remained was something steadier, something like acceptance. And one evening Marcus called, asking if I wanted to meet for dinner. Not at a diner this time, but at a small cafe near the hardware store, where the owner knew his name and trusted him with closing duties on Fridays. And when I walked in, he was already there, sitting by the window, hands folded, posture straight in a way that told me he had rehearsed this moment. And he said, "Dad, I think I am ready to talk about the day in the hospital." And the air shifted like the room itself, held its breath, and I told him to speak if he needed to. And he said he remembered the weight of the pills in his pocket, the way his heart raced, the way Nicole whispered that everything would be fine, that I would thank him one day. And he said nothing felt fine. Even then, that something inside him had screamed, but he buried it, because fear and greed and shame had braided themselves around him until he could not tell where Nicole ended and where he began. And when he finished, he looked up at me with eyes that were finally his again, not clouded by excuses or anger or hunger, and he asked if I hated him, and I told him the truth that hate had never entered the equation, that grief had, that shock had, that disappointment had, but hate never had. And he closed his eyes and let out a breath that sounded like surrender or release, or the first step of a long climb. And afterward, we walked outside into the cooling dusk, and he pointed to the construction site across the street, where the building was rising, steel bones glowing softly in the fading light. And he said, "Dad, I want to build something that lasts." And I said, "So do it, and I will be here to see it." And as we parted ways, I realized that this strange, winding story that began with a scratch-off ticket and a chipped mug of coffee had to become something else entirely, a story not about money or betrayal, but about the brutal miracle of second chances. And I drove home past the quiet houses, blooming roses, and for the first time in years the world felt balanced enough for me to breathe without remembering the weight of what almost happened. And when I reached my porch, I sat for a long moment, listening to the night settle around me, thinking that maybe healing was not a single moment, but a collection of ordinary evenings where nothing goes wrong and no one tries to take anything from you. And forgiveness grows not in grand gestures, but in small, safe routines. And in that gentle quiet, I whispered a thank you to Margaret, to the luck that saved me, to the guard who paid attention, and yes, to the sun who finally chose the hard road back, and the night air felt soft on my skin, carrying the promise of whatever tomorrow might bring.